And there he is. Welcome.
Buongiorno.
Good morning, Will. How you doing?
I am well, thank you. Good morning to you. So,
Very good,
I
thanks.
forget, tell me, in Italy, do they say buongiorno or buonasera for the afternoon? What is the term that they use?
Yeah, about around here, because it differs from place to place. Around here, about any time after 1:30, 2-ish, it's buonasera.
Buonasera.
Yeah, buonasera. Got two times a day. Buongiorno and
Is
buonasera.
there no, like, good night thing in Italy, or is that?
Yeah, buonanotte, but like in English too, you read somebody on the streets and say good night. It doesn't jive. But
A little odd. Yeah, I was thinking about that.
yeah,
I remember when I was in Greece, it was kalaspera and
sure.
kalanikto for good day and good evening or good night. And
Mm-hmm.
what was the morning one? Kalaspera, kalanikta, and
Calimera?
Calamita. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay,
Yeah,
Calimera.
for the morning. Yeah.
Yeah, see, classical Greek comes in handy even if you're traveling. You could navigate quite a bit
Sure. Yeah. I can understand.
if you could.
Stuff. There's a bit to talk about in this episode of this chapter of Tolkien, and there's some things I wanted to, if you don't mind, go back to before we
Mm-hmm.
start up.
Yeah, do lots.
One of them is that we had talked kind of offline about the passage out of John and about the light, the darkness, not comprehending the light. And we had talked a little bit
Yes.
the way the language works based on that. And I thought it might
Mm-hmm.
be interesting to go back to that, just to visit that for a second, because it seems to me Tolkien really understood this, how language works. And he was responsible for, if I'm not mistaken, organizing the dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary. That was one of his major projects.
I believe that's the case. Yeah, he had some part in that there.
So he would have been very aware of the nuances of language and the nuances of words. And
Oops.
it's not too far off to say that when he's choosing his words, he's very careful about it and very careful about what the language is that he's using. So here's a little tidbit about John that I thought would be neat to go back to. The passages out of First John, when we talked about in the beginning, was the word, the term for word is logos, and that describes the whole mathematical system that the ancient world was familiar with. And at the end of First John 1 through 5, it says, and the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehendeth it not. So we had talked about how the Latin was et lux in tenebris lucet, et tenebrae eam non comprehenderent. And that comprehenderunt is to comprehend the light. So the darkness doesn't comprehend. Comprehenderunt is slightly different from the darkness comprehended it not. There's a slight difference, comprehend and comprehenderunt, because comprehenderunt has the nuance of not just encompassing and enfolding, but also the nuance of understanding. Whereas in English, we talk about comprehend, we normally use it as understanding rather than like envelop or encasing. We don't normally.
Right.
So for the Latin, there's a slight difference. The Latin is taken from, if I'm not mistaken, is it translated from the Greek? Jerome translates from
Greek. Yeah, he's using Greek.
Okay.
The original, yeah, John originally wrote in Greek.
Okay, so here's my bad Greek. My bad Greek reads, kai te phos ente Scotia fine, kai e Scotia auto u catalaben. Catalaben.
Catalabe. Yep.
And that catalaben is the same similar word to comprehenderunt or comprehended it not. Catalaben has a little bit more of the encompassing idea rather than the understanding idea. So it has just a slight nuance that goes there too.
So it has a little bit more of which idea? There's a little bit of disturbance in the force there.
Right.
Say it again.
It has a little bit more of the suppressing or enveloping idea rather than the understanding idea. Catalaben.
Yes, much more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Labe being like to cover something. Katam, to cover around.
Exactly.
The way you might wrap up something with a blanket.
So the idea here in the Greek is more that the darkness the darkness doesn't enfold or wrap up the light.
Yeah.
The real difference that I thought was kind of fascinating is in the translation into Anglo-Saxon, because the translation that was done, and I forget the date, I'm sorry, I think it was around maybe 700-800s, roughly around the time of Beowulf, when the West was created, or am I off?
Mm-hmm. That sounds right from what you had sent me. If I don't recall much better, but that sounds.
If I'm off,
I think about the right time.
If I'm off by 200, 300 years, then just everybody has to forgive me on that. So all those Wessex scholars out there that are gonna like come at me suddenly. Sorry.
They're a fierce crowd.
They are.
You better watch out.
Of course. Dye their beards. Anyway, this was translated. The Wessex is a series of works that were translated or written in Anglo-Saxon and Old English, and among them they include the Gospels that were written into Anglo-Saxon. So you can actually read the Gospels in Old English if you're into that. So in the Gospel of John, that same line of the light shines in the darkness and the darkness comprehends it not. Here's my bad Anglo-Saxon. Anthe lea lit on thistrum thet negenomen. So that the comprehenderunt, the katalaben, the comprehend, is translated into Anglo-Saxon as genomen. That's a really interesting nuance there, because the other three, the Greek, the Latin, and the English, they're very similar to one another. But in the Anglo-Saxon world, you had a world that was primarily a world of words. They were very aware of how words had power, and they were an oral society primarily. So they had all these stories told around the campfire and passed on to one another, and they talked about words as having a magical power to them. So they used the word here of genomen instead of katalaben or comprehenderunt in order to get that idea across, of the darkness not surrounding or not understanding the light. But this is the interesting thing. Genomen is to name something. So that here you have the darkness, thistro. It is basically naming the light, but it couldn't name the light. In other words, if you name the thing in Anglo-Saxon, you control it, you encompass it, you snuff it. And so naming in Anglo-Saxon has a real power to it, that once you find the name for the thing, you control it. I just love that. I think that's
like knowing Rumpelstiltskin's name. The only way to exercise Rumpelstiltskin out, the queen had to guess his name, right? So that having the name of a thing is to have power over
to have the name,
the inner essences of the thing.
Right.
Oh, that's cool.
Or if I could use a modern example, Rumpelstiltskin's a great example, because of course it is a Germanic tale. But I think it's a Germanic tale. It may be Italian in origin. But the other example I was thinking was Ursula Le Guin in her Earthsea trilogy. I don't know if you
okay. I'm not familiar with those.
I highly recommend it. The Earthsea trilogy, the first three books, which are A Wizard of Earthsea, Tombs of Adawan, and The Farthest Shore. And in that, she creates a little world, kind of like Tolkien, creates a little world called Earthsea, where the main character, Jed, or Ged, as some people pronounce it, has to wrestle with a demon that he unleashes by accident, because he's trying to show off for friends, and he basically releases a demon into the world called a Gebeth. And this Gebeth goes around the world destroying things, and he has to hunt it down, basically, as his job. But in that, her system of magic, we talk about systems of magic, like in Tolkien's system of magic. Her system of magic is learning the right word for the thing. Because for her, every beginning was created through words. So when you find a word for the thing, you can control the thing or change its nature or change its appearance, but you can never actually change its nature, because its nature is bound up with an essential word. So all the wizards in the story, their whole job is to learn words and learn about words.
Yes. Yeah.
And she draws that directly from this Anglo-Saxon thing, I think. I don't know if I...
That's very cool.
It is very cool. It's a great series. I really recommend it. I don't know if I would say she's as ornate as Tolkien or as theologically correct as Tolkien, but she's beautiful as a writer.
So that's very interesting because so you mentioned that just as so the name and the light wasn't able to name the darkness, that Negenamen. Um, and to name it, so you've got the Anglo-Saxon sense of to name a thing is to know the thing, to have power over. 'Cause names as words have magical essence. The right name, as we actually, I just gave a lecture a week or two ago about this from the Never-Ending Story, by Michael Ende. And one of the things that he has, the childlike ember, and most of you are probably familiar with the Never-Ending Story, is a wonderful 1980s classic film derived from the book. But and the childlike empress says the right name gives things their meaning. The wrong names make everything unreal.
Mm.
That's what lies do. And so this is important. Like, and I'm using this as a conceptual bridge, not to impose something on the text, but to highlight for us something that historically would be, what is also happening at around actually a couple centuries earlier. It just to show the connectedness here. This is not a merely culturally contextual way of looking at things. You reason, it's not just because Anglo-Saxons said the name has power. That's how we'll translate this into here, to see the inner essences of things, or the name of a thing, right? But simultaneously to this, and actually, like I said, the preceding centuries, I've just been reading Evagrius, Pontus, one of the Desert Fathers, who's writing in the 300s, late 300s roughly, maybe early 400s. He is talking about he's embedded in now a monastic tradition, a Greek world, Syriac Greek world monastic tradition of paideia. And one of the things that he's drawing on, one of the things that in this particular text I was going over last night, is about seeing the inner essences of things, to become to know the inner essences of things, and if to have have a name for the thing is, I mean, if a thing's name, its right name is essentially, it's like you said, its essential word, that is to say, the word that is its essence, its inner essence, then there's something much deeper, not necessarily much deeper going on, but this is also connected to patristic theology, philosophy, patristic metaphysics of the East Mediterranean of the 3rd and 4th centuries. So that you've got and we have evidence of this, that of course in modern, what is now England, in the 6th, 7th, and 8th century, you have very, very well educated, erudite, cosmopolitan individuals there doing some of this scholarly work. So that's very cool. They would choose this.
Well, reminds me, Cameron. It also reminds me, Cameron, of that problem that occurred in the 13th century, that scholastic problem. Because the essence of a thing, like you were just mentioning a minute ago, I think the word they used for that was quiddity.
Yeah, they invented the word quidditas. Yeah, the whatness of a thing. The whatness.
And that essential whatness is a concept which is kind of essential to doing any kind of philosophy or philosophical work. You have to know what the thing is in order to be able to talk about it. If all it is just a thing which we give a name arbitrarily, then it's very hard to talk about a thing, because we're not talking about the same thing. We're talking about, you're talking about this, I'm talking about that, and it's like two ships in the night. So the whole philosophical thing breaks down when you start denying this idea of the quiddity, the essence, the essential thing that we're discussing. Which
right, and that's sorry.
Is probably right there at the heart of the scholastic debate anyway, and the collapse at the end of the 1300s or the end of the 1200s.
Yeah, I mean the shift, the nominalist shift to put the meaning of the thing merely into terminology, and essentially evacuate or eviscerate meaning from things themselves. Breaks this. It breaks this connection. It creates a chasm between words and the meanings of things, or the essences of the things and the words we use to describe them. Phenomena of which you're well aware. The essence is to deny the essences. I mean, we like to think. I think just to flesh out a little bit more for anybody who's not as sadly immersed, imprisoned in all this stuff as we are. we tend to think of, essence as just like it's a word, right? It's kind of a philosophical term for this thing, for a thing, maybe the meaning of a thing, something like that. But the word itself, essence, is the gerundic form of being. It's the ising of a thing, and that's in the case in Latin, but it's also the case in Greek, where there's some nuances about, the actual etymology of both of those are somewhat distinct, but it's the isingness of a thing is its essence. It's and like Gerard Manley Hopkins says in that poem that begins with "The kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame." Each thing does what it is, right? It spells out its name. It does that thing. You know, goodness, how does it? Yeah, it's a beautiful poem. It's a beautiful poem. If we can get that up somewhere. But to do, yeah, each thing cries out its name. For that I came, right? It does one thing and the same. Essentially, its name, its essence is its ising, and he connects this to the name. So here, then, in the Anglo-Saxon version of this version of the Anglo-Saxon translation of the Gospel, the light was not able to name, did not name the darkness did not name the light. It could not name it. It could not penetrate. There's almost a sense of penetrating into its inner essences. The darkness can't penetrate the light. Not only wrap around, it can't enter into it.
The darkness couldn't find out the quiddity of the thing, right? It couldn't find
exactly.
It. Right.
It's entirely barricaded off. It's impotent.
I find
to the light.
I find the less we think that this is merely an academic discussion, because the whole discussion of the scholastic debate is a bit esoteric. But if we think it's just a scholastic debate, I want to bring it down to something might seem mundane, but I don't think it is. And I'm talking about fan rage. Okay.
Say more.
Fan rage. You see a lot of this on the internet these days. There are people that really love the Avengers, or they really love Star Wars, or they really love Star Trek, or they really love the Lord of the Rings. And they hate it when those things are messed with, or muddled with, or screwed up, or
right.
And what they're really angry about is that the essence of the story is monkeyed with, that they screw it up, that they get it wrong. And you get these long tirades by people about how, oh, that's not how so-and-so looks, or that never do this. What they're actually, and I you kind of chuckle at it. I do too. It's like, okay, calm down there, Eugene. It's not all. But it is. That's the really interesting thing to me. It is important because we talk in high and lofty terms in the academic circles about this Latin term or that Greek term or Aramaic term. But when it comes down to it, most people live by the stories that they enjoy, that they engage in. The Western, the sci-fi, or whatever it is that they engage in. And they invest a great deal of time into those stories. And when you don't get it right, when you screw around with it, when you really monkey up the story, you have violated an essence of the story. You've violated the quiddity of the story. So what fan rage is really about is something I think very legitimate. It's a philosophical disagreement to a violation of the quiddity of the thing. I've seen a lot of fan rage, and I've read a lot of fan rage, so I should know what I'm talking about.
Right.
If, for instance, you took, let's beat up on Bezos for a minute, okay? If you took, for instance, a beloved story like, say, I don't know, the Silmarillion, and you put it into a dramatic thing where you were inserting all kinds of things that aren't there in the original, and changing the way characters operate, and altering even the history of the actual story that Tolkien created, you have violated the quiddity of the story. You violated the essence of the thing. And therefore, if I were to use the terms of Ursula Le Guin, you have done a bad magic. You've done a bad magic. Your magic is going to cause damage. And she makes this very clear in a series called the Castle of Owls, I think it's called. It's a 4-part series where the character recognizes that people are doing the ceremony wrong and they're screwing it up, and it's causing bad magic. It causes bad things to happen when you do this. I think that's what, at heart, that human beings recognize that there is an essence to something, and trying to name it is very difficult. But if we deny that it exists at all, and we say, well, it doesn't exist, and I'm just going to say whatever it is. I'm just going to monkey with it. Then we end up doing not just an innocuous thing. We create a bad magic. We create something which is very dangerous to other people, I think, personally.
Mm-hmm.
Case in point, and this is not an intentional segue, but case in point. And by the way, I'm getting a big storm coming in right now, so in case I shut out,
Okay.
because there's a tornado, just so you know.
Oh, fun.
Case in point, I go to research Thranduil, right? Our wood elf king.
Mm-hmm.
I found out some interesting stuff about Thranduil, but I had to force myself to watch the Jackson clips of Thranduil. And I don't know if you've seen them, but they violate the quiddity of Thranduil. Okay?
They do not transmit. They do not faithfully transmit his essence.
They do not. They do not. And I know Tolkien objected to this in general. Was anything put on the stage or the screen, he said he objected to it because it automatically was a translation. You know, the translator is a traitor. So I think with this Thranduil, he's a bit of a treacherous rendition from the Thranduil of the book. And here's the thing.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. The Hobbit, I think, is a beautiful story. And we talk about it on a high philosophical level, but it's a beautiful story that touches a person in a childlike, in a place where they think like a child, okay? In other words, when you're a child, you latch onto certain stories. They're formative of who you are. The Hobbit ends up being one of these stories that is perfect for a childlike vision of the world. It is very complex and it's very intense, but it doesn't act as though it were some piece of high and mighty literature. Instead, it presents things in a way that are like fairy stories, like myths. And when you try to make them all serious and brooding and lugubrious, you automatically violate the very tone of the work. Jack's story, I think, tries so hard to be deep and profound and intense, and goes back to
broody,
the ring, that it really fails to convey what the story is actually about.
Yeah, no, that's the case. I mean, it's basic, context and premise is playing to a certain. I mean, it's playing to commercial interest. What's going to keep the audience, today's 21st century audience, excited and engaged with explosions and, romantic nuances and liaisons that may or may not be there, fleshing that out, because that's what the people want to see. I mean, it's really low vulgar theater, that way.
Whereas the novel,
right, it's very much just trying to create a work of art. It's different.
Question for you: did you ever read, or even try to read, Lord of the Rings?
No, no, but I remember seeing it on the shelves.
Referring to, okay. For anybody who doesn't know what Lord of the Rings is, this was, I don't remember the year exactly, but it was very close to the release of the actual Lord of the Rings. I don't know if you're looking it up or not, but I'm looking up the date just to make sure.
The actual Lord of the Rings movie, you mean?
No. This was in 1969. This was.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
and it was Lord of the Rings was released in what, 50s, 60s. So
it must have been 50s.
50s, yeah. Publication date, 29th of July, 1954. Hey, there's a date we need to celebrate. The 29th of July, okay, 1954 was the release of the Fellowship of the Ring. And this Lord of the Rings was released in 1969, the year I was born. Ta-da! It was a parody, a short novel written by Henry Beard and Douglas Kenney. They went on to found National Lampoon.
Yes. Okay.
This was published by Signet Press for Harvard Lampoon. And it takes the story of the Lord of the Rings and it makes it slapstick humor, bathroom humor, sexual humor, crudity. You have scenes of the characters using the bathroom. You have scenes of characters having carnal relations with each other. The whole thing is it's a farce basically. And I think they were trying to go something like the Monty Python route or something. But my point,
Yeah.
I haven't touched this thing since I first tried to read it back in the 80s. It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. It really takes this great story and it wrecks it. As my father used to say, it's kind of like taking the story of Jesus and the story of the Gospels and blaspheming all over the place with the Gospels. Similar thing to it. And I think that this is the example of the extreme example of what I'm talking about. Because I think Jackson, for all his flaws, I think he was trying to be honest with the works. I really do. I just think his vision is limited. Something like this ends up being a dishonest work where it really violates the nature of the text itself. And consequently causes people to think this is what the actual text really is. This is, I think, where the danger lies, this danger of violating the quiddity of something. That the Lord of the Rings or things like it get circulated, like the Life of Brian by the Monty Python,
Mm-hmm.
they get circulated.
Right.
People know that more than they know the original text.
Yes.
And then they end up laughing at the original text. I mean, who doesn't? When you read Arthur, or when you talk about the Arthur story, or you mention, okay, we're going to study Arthur, how many times do students start like banging coconuts together, and saying,
Right.
knee? The knights just say knee. And it's funny
Because
but
that's the primary reference story is Monty Python, and the original, as it were, but like Mallory. The primary reference story is Monty Python, and Mallory's version is seen as a derivative or secondary, boring version of the Monty Python, which is fundamental.
Yeah, and I wonder about this too. I mean, I have something of a sense of humor. I'm sometimes funny, and I like to laugh. Nobody likes a good joke. Nobody more than me. Perhaps my wife. But I wonder about whether or not laughing at certain things is okay, is innocuous. Certainly, laughter at something or ridicule of something is necessary at times, but there are some things which I think you need to know what it has to be taken seriously, and you need to know there are things that are to be taken seriously, so that when you get the reference, you can laugh when necessary. But if you laugh all the time at something or parody something all the time, or just thought that it doesn't matter how you portray the character, I think it runs into some dangerous waters, which is what I think fan rage, again, I think fan rage is reacting to this. It's reacting to this idea that you're doing something really unholy, something almost blasphemous when you violate this image that is so sacred to my world view.
Yeah.
Whether it's Star Wars.
I think that's fair.
So all this is sort of a long way around to get at a point here, which is, what is this character of Thranduil? We're doing Barrels Out of Bond today, allegedly. And Barrels Out of Bond, this is the midpoint chapter, right? Because there are 19 chapters total, which is 9 and 9 plus 1. So this is the midpoint chapter. And you would expect at the midpoint chapter, like in the Odyssey, the midpoint chapter, you would have some image of deliverance and transference into a new realm, into a new world. Well, what do we have? In some, we've got Bilbo freeing the dwarves from the captivity by the elves, and they're emerging in the next chapter to be reborn into the final stage of their quest, which is to go up to the mountain, to Erebor. It's a central piece to the frieze of the work. I talk about a work like a Greek frieze, the front of a temple, where the things on one side balance the other things on the other side in a chiasmatic way. So Barrels Out of Bond is a chapter where Bilbo frees the dwarves, or comes up with the idea to free the dwarves out of their captivity, and he does so by packing them into these barrels, and they get thrown down into the water by the elves, and they float away until they get to essentially Lake Town. Okay, so that's the essence of the story.
Yes.
So in this, I think it would be important to look at, what does the real Thranduil look like? What is that real character of Thranduil? And what is it that we're dealing with when we deal with this image of the release of the dwarves? So those are my two main here. Well, both of them tying back in a way to the idea of what kind of words we're using and whether those words are significant or whether we can just monkey with them whenever we want to. So let me ask your opinion on this. The character of Thranduil. What do we know about this guy? What do we know about Thranduil, the Elven King?
But here we are, the Elven King. Here sat the Elven King, on his pillars hewn out of the living stone, on a chair of carven wood. On his head was a crown of berries and red leaves, for autumn was come again. In the spring he wore a crown of woodland flowers. In his hand he held a carven staff of oak. And this is all in the side of a hill again. So the Elven King, Ian Thranduil and his folk in Mirkwood live in the same kind of structure as Bilbo lives in.
Mm-hmm.
So we're in a cave in the side of a hill, not again unlike where the goblins were. Very different. And in fact, there's a connection that's drawn between them. He says not at all like the goblin place underground, and yet not like the Hobbit hole underground, but another kind of place underground, right? So again, we're entering into this mound, this hillside dwelling, and here it sounds like it's a whole, not just a palace, but a palatial complex, right? A city, veritable city built into the side of the hill, much like the one that I live upon right now in Orvieto in Italy. But so again, we've got that similarity, just to draw the connection about rebirth and renewal, entering into new phases. But he seems merry. So the reason I mention this is underground is that lest we think it's just dark, right? Where it's framed up already as a place that's not. It's underground, but it's not dark.
Right.
It's not like what we see later in Lord of the Rings with Lothlorien. It's up in the trees and it's filled with light and kind of fairy sparkles, if you will. Like it's getting them more that this is definitely earthbound and in the forest. These are the elves that did not heed the call. They responded to the call of the gods to some degree, but they tarried and stayed this side of the mountains. They didn't even go to the shores to eventually go over to Middle Earth. They didn't, not Middle Earth, but to go over to the Blessed Realm. Whereas, there's other elves had gone all over, from where they were first created. They moved west. They heeded the call of the gods. They went off to the Blessed Realm, and then a number of them made their way back to Middle Earth thousands of years later, and so on. So there's, you've got the high elves and these different categories. Well, these wood elves had stayed, so they have never been to the Blessed Isle. Right.
Right.
And so they're of a different kind of order. Still elves, not dark, but, well, earthbound. They're connected to this. And he's very much a spirit of the forest, right? He's one with the spirit of the forest. He's got the autumn crown of berries and red leaves. In spring, he wears woodland flowers. But it seems altogether these elves are like charming, cheerful creatures overall. He's a bit upset about trespassers. He's suspicious of dwarves, and Tolkien tells us, that he's he rightly guesses a little bit more their motivation than what they're letting on. But he's not he's certainly not angsty and broody like the Jackson depiction, and I recall, unfortunately, yet a little of forgive me the name, the 1970s
Yes.
cartoon film, where they're impish. The wood elves are depicted in sort of this greenish impish way, which is totally wholly inappropriate. They're more like the pixies or fairies out of that big book that was also published around back in the day. There was gnomes, and then there was one that was like about pixies and fairies or something like that. These little small impish things. No, so I don't know.
Well,
I've kind of wandered through my own Mirkwood here with that, but
it's good. It's good. I did a little bit of legwork on this, so I was prepared actually this time, unlike last.
Good.
So there are a couple things about Thranduil. I agree with you. The brooding angstiness of Jackson's character is completely
it just doesn't fit.
Inappropriate for a number of reasons. First off, Thranduil is really old. I mean, he is ancient. He was born apparently in the First Age of.
So how old is he?
We're talking thousands of years old. guy was born.
So he's like up there with Elrond or older.
Yes. And he's one of the original Sylvan elves, one of the elves who did not go, as you said, did not go over to the Blessed Lands, to the Undying Lands. His name means, in Sindarin, means vigorous spring. Vigorous spring. So you're right. He's connected to the cycles of the earth. And he's connected especially to that cycle of rebirth and renewal that occurs in the era of Aesir, of the Aesir realm in springtime. So he's very much a character not of death and brooding and darkness, but of life, of vigorous life. And that's what...
He's not a jaded from his war wounds with the worms of the north.
No. That's the technical word for that is bullshit. He is a character who has, on the one hand, seen a great deal, but he continues to be fairly merry about things, very happy about things. He's just extremely guarded, apparently, as a character, because he's seen so much. He was, to be a little bit geeky for a minute, he was the son of Orofer, and he ruled over a woodland realm in this age called Greenwood the Great when he first settled in it. And so he was there at the very founding of his halls. I mean, he was the one who created his halls, and he used dwarvish technology and dwarvish magic in order to create his kingdom, his halls, his fortress. And then the necromancer moves into the south of Mirkwood and begins to poison Mirkwood and causes it to become known as Mirkwood by the time of the establishment even of the Shire. So by the time that the hobbits are running about there in the Shire, Mirkwood has changed from Greenwood to Mirkwood. So he has seen this change over time. It's not something that has just happened and he just happens to take up residence in northern Mirkwood. He saw it as Greenwood the Great, and he saw it from the very beginning of the world as Greenwood the Great, which is another thing to keep in mind. So the idea of him, on the one hand, being brooding and dark is really wrong, because he himself has seen much worse things that have not scarred him. They've just made him very guarded. But the other thing that I really think is a total misinterpretation, it is a violation of the quiddity of this character, is that he is himself not haughty and not full of his own importance. He hates the spiders and he hates the necromancer, because they're creatures of darkness. But other creatures of light, he actually helps to prosper, as we see later on in the novel. So for him to be haughty and petulant like a teenager, which is how the characters portrayed in the movie, it's completely off. There's no way he would be that way. One thing important to note is that, yes, he does fight at the Battle of Five Armies, but Thranduil was also at the Battle of Dagorlad originally. And
oh, really?
Yeah, he fought at the Battle of Dagorlad, which is the great battle, if I'm not mistaken, right before the battle before the Black Gates, where the ring, not at Dagorlad, but after that, the ring is cut from the hand of Sauron. So he saw that happen, and he saw the defeat of Sauron, and he saw the triumph that almost happened, except that the ring was not destroyed. So Thranduil is he's no teenage petulant fellow, okay, full of himself. It just wouldn't work at all. The Battle of Dagorlad is, if I can read here, is the battle that took between the armies of the Last Alliance under Gil-galad and Elendil against an army of orcs and other creatures loyal to Sauron in the plains of Dagorlad, just outside Mordor, between the Emyn Muil and Cirith Gorgor. So it's north of Mordor, but it's east of where Greenwood was, or Mirkwood was. So Sauron is being fought at Dagorlad. Greenwood the Great is still a great forest. Thranduil has been there for some time already. He fights in this battle against Sauron and sees the ring cut from the finger and taken by Isildur. So all that gives a character who would be wise and steady and cautious, but very loving of other creatures. So it makes no sense to make him petulant or brooding or teenagey angst as he does in the movie. So the big question that comes up is, why is he so ticked at the dwarves? what's going on here with this ancient guy living in, as you said, beautiful halls. This is not a dark underground place. This is a beautiful underground kingdom that he has in the side of the hill. Why is he so ticked at the dwarves? What is it that is causing him to be so ticked at the dwarves? Part of it, I think, we find in the text itself. So just a little bit beyond where you read about the woodland flowers crown and all that, the dwarves basically ask him, is it so wrong that we're wandering in the woods looking for help? Okay, so I think this is Balin, because Thorin has already been captured in the previous chapter. He commands that the chains be taken off the dwarves. Thranduil does, and the dwarves are surly and angry, and did not even pretend to be polite. It says, so they're already angry at him, and they're rude. And Balin then says, "What have we done, O king?" said Balin, who was the eldest left. "Is it the crime to be lost in the forest, to be hungry and thirsty, to be trapped by spiders? Are the spiders your tame beasts or your pets, if killing them makes you angry?" Such a question, of course, made the king angrier than ever. So he is ticked at these dwarves. And then he answers, "It is a crime to wander in my realm without leave. Do you forget that you were in my kingdom, using the road that my people made? Did you not 3 times pursue and trouble my people in the forest and rouse the spiders with your riot and clamor? After all the disturbance you have made, I have a right to know what brings you here. And if you will not tell me now, I will keep you all in prison until you have learned sense and manners." And then he ordered the dwarves to be put in a separate cell, and to be given food and drink, but not to be allowed to pass the doors of their little prisons, until one at least of them was willing to tell him all he wanted to know. I think in there is embedded the reason that Thranduil doesn't like the dwarves, gets ticked at the dwarves. I think it shows the character of Thranduil, but also the character of the dwarves. And here's the ticket: in the movie version, the Jackson version, the dwarves are the heroes, the dwarves are the good guys, and the good-looking. I think it's actually that he interrogates Thorin in the scene. The good-looking Thorin is angry at the elves because they let him down, and so he's already ticked at them. And the elves, coming across as haughty and know-it-alls and petulant, are kind of the bad guys, even scarred slightly.
Right.
So the whole face is scarred, so that he comes across as a character who has deep psychological wounds as well as physical wounds. But that's not what's happening here in the text. Right. Yeah. What happens here in the text is that the dwarves are actually the bad guys. The dwarves are the bad guys.
Exactly. They're trespassing. They're waking up the demons.
Yes.
They're generally barging in on the feasting of the elves.
Yeah. Waking up the demons.
Yeah.
Interesting point. That is highlighted, of course, in the next story where they wake up the Balrog.
Right.
The dwarves have a habit, it seems, of waking really dark and evil, sinister creatures.
Mm-hmm.
So what is Tolkien talking about here? What is he saying about the character of the dwarves? What kind of creatures are they? And why do they continue to wake up dark and menacing creatures?
And if to that point, if I can draw on something that's at the very end of the last chapter, but follows with this sequence, when Thorin himself is actually arrested, we're told, the author tells us a little bit about the elves, right? He stops, and a little bit about why there's another connection with that. What is his grievance against the dwarves in general? Why does he not trust exactly what they say? But we're told first, so the elves, like we said, these were wood elves. They remained in the wide world, lingering in the twilight of our sun and moon, but loved best the stars. They wandered in the great forests that grew tall in lands that are now lost. They dwelt most often by the edges of the woods, from which they could escape at times to hunt, or to ride and run over the open lands by moonlight or starlight. And after the coming of men, they took ever more and more to the gloaming and to the dusk. Still elves they were and remain, and that is good people. So we're prefacing the whole thing. They are fundamentally good. They also dwell at the edge of the forest. So we're no longer deep into the forest. If you've arrived at where the elves are, you've really reached the other side. You're almost there. They live at the borderlands between tame and wild, between this world and that world, just as Elrond and his folk are at the edge of the wild. It's the last homely house.
Mm-hmm.
So here we know we're coming to the next. We're coming to the other side of the map. We're coming to the other side of our journey here.
Mm-hmm.
But he says to the history here between elves and dwarves, which is fleshed out further in the Silmarillion, also relates to the reason Celeborn isn't a fan of the dwarves. It isn't merely because they woke up the Balrog next to Lothlorien, but it goes back. And Celeborn's got some really deep stuff going back as to why, some really hand-to-hand combat issues with the dwarves back when they invaded Doriath. But different dwarves at that point, obviously, and many thousands of years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
But here it is. So to the cave they dragged Thorin, not too gently, for they did not love dwarves, and thought he was an enemy. Because in ancient days they had wars with some of the dwarves, whom they accused of stealing their treasure. It is only fair to say the dwarves gave a different account, and said that they only took what was their due, for the Elf King had bargained with them to shape his raw gold and silver, and had afterwards refused to give them their pay. If the Elf King had a weakness, it was for treasure, especially silver and gems, and though his hoard was rich, he was ever eager for more, since he had not yet had as great a store as the other elf lords of old, and so on and so forth. And Thorin, and here, the narrator also kind of excuses, this was well known to every dwarf, so the dwarves should know that these guys are going to view them with suspicion. And so a little cranky on their own account, which is just really rude, If you're the unwelcome guests in a place of a people who may have a prejudice against you, it doesn't do well to start out the conversation by being a jerk, and it's just from a pragmatic perspective, right?
Right.
Because they have no problem being super polite. Thank you very much. Yes, please, thank you very much to Beorn in Beorn's house. And he's not over fond of dwarves. But here they've lost all their educazione, as we say in Italy. They've lost all their good manners. And consequently, Thorin was angry in this. But I think it is an interesting thing that even here, because I know something about this particular incident that's being alluded to, like I said, it's developed elsewhere in the Silmarillion. He says but even in the text, the author betrays a little bit the bias. He tries to lay it out as fair as he can. The elves have their version of the story, dwarves have their version of the story. But you'll notice that the author telling us the dwarves' version of the story is that they, they raided the elf kingdom and stole the stuff, but they were only getting what was their due. It's even the dwarves' version of the story admits of a raid and a battle that they started and provoked, but they were just trying to take back what was theirs.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Rather, it's not really, they're both on even ground. He said, she said, who knows? It's even the dwarves here. And that we find out, of course, is there's more reasons as to why the king didn't pay them their due, as it were. There was the Silmaril involved, and it got complicated. But all that is to say, what are the dwarves here to do, precisely passing through his realm to do? To go back and seize what is their due. And so, and somewhere in here, you mentioned, the author mentions, the narrator mentions that, thus you can see that Thranduil guessed a little bit more about their intentions. Was more like he was closer to the mark than you would have thought.
Yeah, he's stupid.
He didn't just fall off the watermelon truck yesterday.
Yeah, no, he's very intuitive about what's going on. Plus, he has messages and spies and the like coming in all the time to tell him what's going on, the birds,
absolutely,
creatures. So he's very aware of what's going on, I think. And it strikes me as interesting that he doesn't trust the dwarves because of the history, but he also doesn't trust them because he knows they're lying to him and they're withholding information, and it doesn't seem for any good reason.
Right.
Which means they may be up to something rather dangerous there in the in Mirkwood. The rousing of the spiders comes against him as a critique. Right.
Right. If this is a place that's been where the darkness of the necromancer has seeped throughout the forest, evidently for centuries, there's no saying that whose side they're on. Like, they could be either directly under his influence or at least siding a little more favorable to him. They've done this in the past, right? There were the 7 rings for the dwarf lords. You know the dwarves have had connections in the past with the Dark Lord, and so it's wise to be cautious. And especially if, like you said, they're obviously obfuscating something
Right.
with no clear good reason for it, it doesn't make their case any better.
Which speaks to the character of the dwarves again. You know, we see the dwarves as sort of part of the story of the protagonist. They're connected to the hero, and so we look at them kind of, and we look at them as, yeah, they're kind of goofy, but generally speaking, they're decent people. What we don't take into account is the possibility that they may be the bad guys, or they may be the guys who are not. Bilbo maybe hitched his wagon to the wrong star, so to speak, because these dwarves are grasping. They are very closed. They are very angry, easily angered. They are characters that are kind of reckless with things that they don't hold to be valuable, as we saw back in the beginning with the glasses and plates there in Bilbo's household.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not characters necessarily who take a great deal of care for other creatures and other beings. So their being there in Mirkwood it could very likely be a threat to the elf king and his people. So there's actually more reason for Thranduil to be angry at them and to be cautious with them and to lock them up than there is for him to say, oh yeah, you guys traipsed through the forest and you roused up all the spiders. It's okay, you guys go your way.
Don't worry about it. You've had a rough go.
Yeah, you've had a rough go.
Yeah.
There's also
and we see that their true nature begins to be revealed the closer they get to the treasure.
Yeah.
And we'll see this in the chapters that come forward, and of course ultimately the way that they treat Bilbo, and it gets resolved well, but we see the real weaknesses of the dwarves come into the fore.
Yeah, and the weaknesses that become very dangerous weaknesses too. So here we're seeing them as the put upon characters, and they're portrayed that way in most renditions. But I think Tolkien he's very clever in this, that he makes us sympathize with the perspective of Bilbo, and Bilbo's perspective is wound up with the dwarves, not with the elves. So there's that. I know I just looked this up, and I had an inkling that I had an inkling that the story of the dwarves not getting paid for their treasure might have some roots in something older, and it does. There are 2 stories in Norse mythology that this connects directly to. One is the story of the building of the walls of Asgard.
Okay.
In that story, I forget the name of the giant, but a giant comes to build the walls of the Aesir's fortress, and he says he'll do it in such and such amount of time. And he does do it in such and such amount of time. He gets one of the goddesses as his bride, and he produces this horse that helps him out. So the gods are like, yeah, no way you'll ever do that. And he almost does. He gets very close within a day or two of doing it. So they have to hire Loki, and Loki goes out and pretends to be a mare, and the horse, the stallion, chases him off, and that's a whole nother thing. But it reduces the amount of work that the giant can do, so he can't finish within time, and so he doesn't get paid. And he's very angry about it. So the gods basically cheat the giant out of his pay. These are the Aesir, the gods, of Norse mythology.
Yeah.
The other story is where the dwarves, is it Brocky, I think? Brocky and his brother? Brocker and his brother, yeah. And they basically make gifts for the gods. And they say if the gifts are good enough for the gods, we want recompense, we want payment. And they give all these beautiful gifts to the gods, including Mjolnir they give to Thor. And that's how Mjolnir comes about. And in exchange for this, they want the head of Loki. And the gods refuse to pay that. They refuse to give the head of Loki for the hammer, for Thor. So anyway, the point being is that the Aesir do cheat the dwarves out of their payment a couple times in Norse mythology. So this is not without precedent that you have the elves, kind of like the Aesir, cheating the dwarves out of their payment. Nevertheless, the character we're seeing here in the dwarves is a grasping, closed, easily angered, thinking only in terms of wealth or riches kind of character. And don't take kindly to the elves probing and trying to find out about their wealth and their riches.
Right. I like this because I think in well, let's say much of the modern world, we have a tendency to, we're shaped. We live in a culture, a society that sympathizes more with the idea of, go seize what's due to you, go grab what's yours. So we might be prone to sympathize a little bit more with the dwarves' response about being cheated. You got to go get. You got to look up this cowboy mentality that's been sort of colonized worldwide. Is something, I think it's a dominant way of looking at things today. And so just to highlight, what else would the dwarves have done? Well, perhaps the dwarves in both cases could have appealed to the gods, some higher justice or something, said, hey, you owe us this. We're going to take this to a higher tribunal. Instead, in fact, the dwarves being a little bit more like a petulant teenager, pre-adolescent, goes busting into his sister's room to go take his toy back.
Yeah.
Punches are in the way, rather than going telling mom and dad or appealing to some higher sort of sense.
Yeah.
Something very different happened.
Yeah, it raises the question here for me of a couple questions here about the dwarvish character. Why didn't the dwarves know that there were elves in the forest? That's striking to me. They didn't do it.
Or why didn't they mention it to us? Clearly, because he says all this was known to every dwarf.
Yeah.
Right, the history, the backstory. And they used to live at Lonely Mountain. Like, Thorin remembers the Lonely Mountain like the back of his hand. He knows the Elf King is there. He knows we're going right by this. I know how to get there without a map. I don't need no maps. I'm on my way. So he knows this guy's like, you guys used to live next to each other. You were his neighbor, for crying out loud.
Yeah. Let me add one more thing.
So
Let me add one more thing to that. If dwarves are as long-lived as they are, then it's possible that his ancestors, maybe even he, worked on the building of Thranduil's Hall, because
that's quite possible.
Technology and dwarf workers to build his hall, his fortress. So,
and if it was in the days of Thorin's grandfather that they moved down there to the Lonely Mountain, presumably his grandfather oversaw those works from the dwarf side.
It's highly possible, which again begs the question: what the hell, Thorin? Did you not? What else were there? Were you not going to tell?
Did that not occur to you, dude? Did you just leave that out of your calculations?
I mean, maybe it's okay. We always have to take into account the possibility that Tolkien didn't think things through, and this is just accidental, and he was just trying.
This is a guy who obsessively thought things through. Reams of stuff that is unpublished because he thought things through.
Yeah, so the only is that he was making a point here, that he did this intentionally. It has to do with the character of the dwarves. They didn't want to tell certain things because they were very closed, very secretive. And this is shown with their response to Gandalf a couple times. They don't tell Gandalf certain things. And Gandalf doesn't tell them certain things in return, right? When are we going to tell me you have a map anyway, Gandalf?
How did you get hold of it? I did not get hold of it. Thank you very much. I'm not like you.
Yes. And the dwarves are frequently people that hide things from others, and they are, to be really pejorative, they are dishonest folk generally.
And we'll get and Tolkien goes on a little dwarf rant a little later on when we get to the door of when we actually get to the mountain with the dragons that hidden the secret door, and they're going to send Bilbo in. We pause and we reflect on the nature of dwarves for a little bit, which when we get there we'll see a parallel to that same description being given to another sort of creature earlier on in the book, and thus we'll meet that parallel.
Right.
But here they are.
Right.
The dwarves might have some problems.
Yeah, maybe a little. I mean, I like what you started to read with that exchange between Thranduil and Thorin, but the conversation between the two that occurs in the previous chapter is itself worth reading too, because this is something about the character of Thorin, and thus the character of the other dwarves as well. This is back in
he's their leader.
Chapter 8. Yes, exactly. This is chapter 8. So the king looked sternly on Thorin when he was brought before him and asked him many questions, but Thorin would only say that he was starving. There's a theme there, okay? Starving. Why did you and your folk 3 times try to attack my people at their merrymaking? Asked the king. Because that's their perspective. They're being attacked.
What?
We did not attack them, answered Thorn. We came to beg because we were starving. Where are your friends now, and what are they doing? I don't know, but I expect starving in the forest. What were you doing in the forest? Looking for food and drink, because we were starving. But what brought you into the forest at all? Asked the king angrily. And at that, Thorin shut his mouth and would not say another word. So it's kind of like, it reminds me of dealing with a teenager who has done something wrong.
That's exactly it. I think you nailed it right on the head. And the way that Tolkien tells us about, the narrator's comments here, okay, well, here's the backstory a little bit. It's fair to say this, is like a parent explaining to their kids in unpleasant sort of global crisis between 2 nations. It's hard to say who's right and wrong. Well, there are these things, but they clearly side with one or the other,
Right.
But with trying to sound fair. And so you've got this kind of dynamic going on. I think you're right. It's like trying to talk to a teenager who's done something wrong. He's been caught in the act. You know he did it. You just don't know what exactly.
Right. Right. And
Yeah.
I love how Tolkien puts us in the perspective of sympathizing with Thorin and sympathizing with the dwarves.
Mm-hmm.
So we're anticipating them being correct and Thranduil being kind of an obstacle. But really,
Right.
at the same time, he is indicating that Thorin is really in the wrong. And the dwarves, they're really in the wrong. Thranduil is in every right doing what a king should do. And in
Right.
utmost kindness for characters that, in his perspective, are dangerous, rebellious, a threat to his king.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Or at least you just can't trust him, and that's a fact.
Yes. Right. You can't trust dwarves ultimately. So, and that, not to reveal too much foreshadowing here, but that does change later on. Partly because it's also important to note for fans of the novel, this is also the father of Legolas Greenleaf later on, in the story. So our man Legolas is not he's not a high elf. He doesn't dress in white. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have white hair. Again, unlike the movie. He is a Sylvan elf, a gray elf, a wood elf. He would have been in brown, and he would have had a darker hair or yellow hair. Mm-hmm. And he would have been a character who was not a high, tall elf like the ones that had gone off to the Undying Lands. But more to the point, the character of Legolas is a reflection of his father, Thranduil. So you can't have a petulant, angry, surly Thranduil and have a wonderful, noble Legolas. I mean, you could, but usual.
And that's that's where we see, and it's all the more so in the story than in the movies, The Lord of the Rings now with Legolas, is it's so significant that he should be forging, like he of all elves, forging then this friendship with Gimli, son of Gloin. So Legolas, son of Thranduil, is forging a friendship with Gimli, son of Gloin, a very a deep spiritual bond between the two of them.
Yeah, and the hints of that are throughout the story, starting with the beginning there in the house of Elrond, with the Council of Elrond.
Right.
But there's a great image in there where they get to Moria, and the elvish dwarves, pretty sure they're elvish dwarves.
Elf dwarves.
Elvish dwarves lead into the road that goes through Moria, which is a dwarvish city. Okay, so there's an elvish road through the midst of the dwarvish city. And the entrance into Moria, you have to say Methlon, friend, in order that they open. So there's indication that the dwarves and elves were close for some time.
Right.
And that again happens with Legolas and Gimli later in the story. I think Gimli, is he the son of Balin, is it? He's
Gimli, son of Gloin.
Gloin, okay, so he's the son of Gloin. But Balin is the one who falls in Moria and dies and is buried there, and they find him in that great scene there.
Yeah.
With the rings, right? Okay, so he's son of Gloin. All right. So you've got the son of Gloin, you've got the son of Thranduil becoming good friends in the Lord of the Rings.
So you see something of Thranduil's character then in.
Yeah, exactly.
in Legolas.
You know, by the way,
Yeah.
just as a side note, you had mentioned earlier the animated Hobbit thing. I looked it up. The character who voices in the animated Rankin Bass version, the character is Otto Preminger, and
Okay.
they do show the elves as impish, almost like more like sprites or something than actual elves.
Hmm.
And I don't like it. I mean, I don't like the rendition there because it's just too creepy, weird. But
Yeah.
Preminger was a very popular Preminger. He was a very popular actor back in the 1950s and 60s, and he stars in one of my favorite war movies called Stalag 17. He plays
Really?
the commander in Stalag
Yeah.
17, right? Hi, gets his boots together. What does he say? Something like, "There's supposed to be some ham in your soup. You will not get it." You know. So every time I hear the Thranduil from that version, I hear, "Do not get more blankets." The guy who plays,
Which fits the Dwarves' perspective on the situation.
yeah, right. The guy who plays Thranduil in Battle of Five Armies, Jackson's version, is Lee Pace, and Pace is actually a fairly decent actor. He's been in a couple other movies. The one that most stands out for me, which made the scene with Thranduil hard, is he plays in Guardians of the Galaxy as Ronan, as the bad guy, the big dark, blue painted face character who ultimately gets defeated by a dance off at the end of the movie. So again, it's like I can't watch that version of Thranduil without thinking about that dance off at the end of Guardians of the Galaxy. Wanting Thranduil and Thorin to get down. It just, again, it's part of that sort of translator as a traitor thing. Sorry, that's just a slight tangent. Let me go back here for a minute to the character of the Wood Elves too, because Rankin Bass portrays them as imps, and Jackson portrays them almost as evil, almost as sinister, very dark armor and brooding. But they're not that way in Tolkien. As you said, they're not orcs. They're good people, and so they care for others, and they even treat the dwarves fairly decently. And they're hauled
multiple meals a day.
Sorry?
It's worth pointing out they're given multiple meals a day.
Yes.
They were bringing the evening meal to them when Bilbo found out where they were, something like that. Like, oh, okay, well, they've got it fairly decent if confined.
Yeah. Yes, right. So the elves are actually treating them fairly well, and they are people who are merry, like the people in Rivendell, but they're more guarded.
Yeah.
They're far more guarded. And how do we know they're merry? They sing, and they love wine.
Exactly.
Feast in the forest. So even in the midst of Mirkwood becoming this dark, infected place, these elves are still extremely happy. They're joyful people. They are not dark and brooding.
They're able to be merry in the midst of the darkness. The darkness doesn't penetrate. It can't name. It doesn't genamen. It can't comprehend.
Yes.
Their merriment.
Yeah, it doesn't comprehend them. Yeah, good point.
That's awesome.
Good point. I like the fact that Tolkien makes his elves have a weak spot for wine. For them, wine is. Let me get the light up here. It's getting really dark out. I cut short suddenly and be like, "It's a twister! It's a twister!"
That's right.
Looking at a totally black sky there to the north, and off to the south is this brooding cloud. So I'm very, this is very Sauron here.
Yeah.
My point is that I find it amusing that the Wood Elves are fond of wine, and there's a whole scene there where the butler and the jailer get drunk, and it's kind of comical and humorous that they do. There's something to be said about people that really enjoy conviviality and really enjoy wine.
Yeah.
That kind of happiness.
That's right.
They don't make their own wine, though. Their wine comes
it doesn't grow
our way. So they're importing it, much like the English would have imported wine, because English wine is,
precisely.
It wasn't always that way. They used to produce in the 1200s. Apparently, they produced better wine than the Italians.
Really?
Yes, apparently it was during the 1200s. There was a warming period, sometime between 1200, and it was warm enough that the vineyards in England, which is where we get the word vineyard anyway, a yard where you produce wine, the vineyards of England were warm enough that they actually produced great wine. And the Pope had to step in and say, no more wine from England, or you have to put a tariff on it, because it was threatening the Italian wine merchants and the production of wine. So thank goodness for the global cooling in 1315, because it destroyed the crop in England of wine production.
Right.
But I think that Tolkien is playing off of that idea of English people.
Yeah.
Wine.
No, I think that's very likely.
So we get to the characters of Galleon and the jailer, and this is Bilbo.
Yes.
He finds them drunk and he steals the keys and he frees the dwarves. Here's an interesting little tidbit about that. The name Galleon is kind of an odd name, and it basically, he's the butler, which is an Anglo-Saxon word for the bottler, one who bottles.
He bottles.
But name
yes.
play joke. Again, Tolkien being the philologist he was always making these jokes that only he would get. You just see the old man snickering over his own little joke which is typical. But in the word galleon is a version of galeot, and galeota, is a diminutive form of galea from Latin, which is a galley, a ship. Okay. So he himself is he's the character that ships the dwarves away from prison. He is the character that gets
fascinating.
The captain of the ship, so to speak. And I'm sure that Tolkien at least had that in his mind somewhere. He was making a play on words. The reference that comes up in my mind when I read that was a reference to Dante, because Dante makes a similar joke in his Inferno. And this is Inferno, Canto 5, line 137, between Paola and Francesca in the realm of the lustful. And Francesca said, we were reading this book, and the book was lascivious, and it basically led us to kiss one another, and that's how our affair started. And I betrayed my husband because of this book. And so the book was itself something that caused the affair. It was a real galeot, she says. So
that's right.
The footnote says that is a reference to Galahot, the character Galahot.
Right, the character in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who is he is a character who, they say in the footnote, hides Lancelot and Guinevere while they make love so that Arthur doesn't find them. Okay. Yes, I'm sure it was. But in the Italian, pardon me for my bad Italian, Galeotto fu il libro e chi la scrisse. Galeotto. In other words, it's not Galahot, it's Galeot. And so I think Dante is making a play on words at that point. And he's saying, yes, the book was definitely a Galeot. A Galeot. It was a galleon. It carried us over to that realm of damnation. And they blame the book.
Right.
Character. It's the ship that carries them into bondage and darkness and imprisonment in hell. And I wonder, is Tolkien thinking of that image of carrying over into hell and imprisonment and reversing it here, where Galleon is the character that bears them out of hell and imprisonment into freedom? I don't know. I just think it's interesting.
It could be. It could be.
One way or the other.
It seems plausible.
One way or the other, he seems to be indicating that these characters, the elves, are part of the reason why the dwarves escape. It's because they are themselves prone to wine.
He himself gets carried off, as it were,
carried away
by the heady vintage of Dorwinion, which has to be some wine to make a wood elf, drowsy. Galleon the butler. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know. And
it's intriguing, too, that the image that we get of Bilbo in the hall of the Elven King is an image almost of purgatory. It says the effect of, here it is, I am like a burglar who can't get away, but must go on burgling the same house day after day. This is the dreariest and dullest part of all this wretched, tiresome, uncomfortable adventure. I wish I was back in my hobbit hole by my warm fireside with a lamp shining. So we talked last time about that longing, that sense of longing for a beauty in the forest. But
Yeah.
Bilbo never says in Mirkwood, this is the dreariest part of the whole thing. It's this time in the Hall of the Elven King. This is the dreariest time for him, darkest and dreariest.
Because there's no boredom in the forest. Where here, you've exhausted all the possibilities. You're stuck in this place, and you can't become invisible.
Right, right. And if you do become invisible, people trot on you, or
you can't become visible again. Yeah. Rather,
you even when you are invisible, people trot on you, and you have to see stuff all the time, and you still get cold and exhausted. So it's like a purgatory image for him. He is trapped in this role of being a thief, and he doesn't like being a thief. What greater imprisonment could there be to cure a thief of being a thief, but then that you get to be a thief over and over again? There's a great comic by Piraro who does the comic strip Bizarro, and I'll have to away, but the guy's standing there with a devil in hell, and they're staring at a TV, and he says to the devil, "Hey, I didn't know you had TV in hell." And the devil says, "We have nothing but TV in hell." Like, you want food? No. You want sleep? No. Companion? No. But we have TV.
Just TV, and you can't change the channel.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Now, what that refers to, kids, is back in the day, there used to be this box called a television set. You had to change the channel from this thing if you didn't like what you were seeing.
Yeah.
Or if you were particularly backward, you had to get up from the couch, walk over to it, and turn a knob, physical thing.
Exercise. A little exercise. Yeah, I wonder about that. Just I wonder about that with our current era, the addiction to the electronic thing. Because as Marshall McLuhan pointed out, the electronic thing extends the nervous system to infinity. That there's never a point where you stop finding things to look at and listen to.
Exactly.
And you never have to get up to change the channel because you're right there. So there.
And in fact, you can be kind of stuck there, and you're invisible.
Yeah.
Because the other side does not see you. You're just invisibly burgling the cyber webs for information, and you have to keep on burgling it forever.
Yes. So is there a point, like with TV? I know there was a point for me, probably for most people of our generations. There was a point where you're like, yeah, I've watched enough. Time to go outside. You're just tired of it. You get sick of it. And you want to go out and like throw stones and stuff. And you do.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering in this current era, I don't know. Is there a point where people say, okay, that's enough Fortnite? Or okay, I'm done with texting and interneting and twittering and all that. I'm going to go.
I don't, because they're designed more like casino logic. You can't get out. And there's something different neurologically, that even just the way the actual screen interface works. In old style TV, it's shooting photons up the lead plate, whatever that makes the light the image. It's a little bit different the way that the interface that we have nowadays with the more flat screens, especially with the touch responsive nature of things. It keeps us touching them, and that itself creates this continuous bond, this imprint kind of bond with the device itself. And of course, another fact, they're extremely portable. So we now have the habit of carrying them, like the ring, in our pocket all the time. And if it's not there, you feel the itch to have it.
Yes, indeed.
And so it's much more addictive in that way, physically and psychologically.
And we ignore the fact that it generates a magnetic field around it that can alter our cells and fry our brains, and ignore the fact that it can actually up and catch on fire in our pocket, and thus incinerate groin. We seem to think, oh, these are okay. Well, these are acceptable losses.
Innocuous device. It used to be you turn the microwave on and you kind of stand a few feet away. Here, you should shove a microwave in your pocket. It's just, I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know an answer to it. I think that currently the idea of casino logic that's a very real thing. Explain what casino logic is?
Well, casinos are designed so you can't get out of them, right? They're easy to get into. I mean, you get into it, right? You can see it. It's from miles around. You go to the casino, there it is. But you get in, and they're dim lit in certain ways. The layout, the architectural layout of a casino is circuits like a labyrinth to keep you in there. Because the whole point of a casino is to keep you in there longer, because if you stay in long enough, you keep dishing money out. And that's why there's drinks given to inhibit your, not only your judgment, your sense of risk, which is primary factor, but also to make it harder for you to remember exactly which one of these hallways, which looks just like all the other ones, leads to the exit, instead of into another game room where there's all these electronic games or gaming tables and all of this kind of stuff. And so it's just that transposed into a virtual interface is the way that most of these, and that's like that was sort of back in the day, maybe 10 years ago, sort of the early framework of how to design things like Facebook and all of that, which of course have only become more and more sophisticated with the neurofeedback that they've been able to gather, the research that's been done on that, the human AI interface that's developed since then. But that's the basic idea, is to make it harder and harder to get out.
Which is a good reason why I've never gone to Las Vegas, because it sounds like a total nightmare to me. I'll watch Ocean's 11. That's about the extent of it for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's everything you need to know about him.
The other thing,
the
other thing that I think is included in that is, I know with things like the slot machines are designed on the one hand to give you just enough desire and feedback to want to keep putting more quarters in there, but never
exactly
a full payoff where you're like, okay, I'm done, I walk away. And then,
right, intermittent rewards.
Yes, and that rolling nature of the slots is mesmerizing.
Which does exactly, and that's the exact same as this. What do you do? How do you move? You navigate through a rolling, scrolling kind of movement. Same thing as it's mesmerizing. It's like looking at it sitting around a fire. You're drawn into looking at it. It works in that same way.
Though a fire is much more conducive to happiness.
Well, fire, because that's the real thing, and this is the perversion of it. So what your brain wants is to sit around a fire and gaze into that, because that spurs contemplation.
Yeah.
This does not spur contemplation. This overfeeds information to keep you moving it, spinning it.
So one has to ask, how do you break that spell? We talked about spell earlier. How do you break?
Yeah. How do you break that spell? Well, how does Bilbo get out?
Yeah. How does Bilbo get out?
He stuffs all his dwarves in barrels and shoves them down the flue. They got to hop down out of the trap door into the water. There's no easy way to escape. There's no getting out the natural way. You have to plunge into the cold waters and ride your barrel out of bond.
Which is a baptism, right? Water being
exactly
an element of death.
And in fact, they don't do. I think an overlooked aspect of this is that they don't escape themselves. They do not escape. They put themselves into barrels, but it's the elves who launch them out, and it's the elves singing who launch them out.
Yep.
So again, here there's these punctuated moments in the story where we have song.
Yep.
And here is the other side. We've got these elves singing to help move them along. It's not the end. It's not the last elf song yet. We see that later when we return by way of, to at Elrond's house on the journey home. But here we've got right in the middle of the next elf song. These are different elves, and they sing differently. If you could do a textual analysis of the poem side by side, you see it's a different style.
Right.
But they're singing about wine.
Hmm.
And if I can launch into that here a little
Please.
bit. Everyone. So for those less familiar with the plot line of what happens here, Bilbo finds the dwarves, gets the dwarves, they go down, they see the butler and the captain of the guard have had too much wine. There they are, they get the key, he liberates the dwarves, right, puts them into these barrels, these empty, most of them were emptied wine barrels, some are emptied apple barrels or butter, other things like that, right? And they're going to get shipped back, rolled back down the stream, and then when empty, then they get filled up by the men of Lake Town. It was kind of a merchant port, and then they get rafted up the stream to the Elf King as full goods. That's how they do their commerce, right? This is the logic of why this is here. Well, the elves then come down, from the feast, in the middle of the autumn feast. There's some elves who you still have business to do, so it's time to throw the barrels down because we need to do that's a chore, and so they do this chore to put the barrels down. And the idea that Bilbo has, of course, is, with the dwarves in the barrels, we can get the elves themselves to launch us out of here and at least send us down the river. And these elves come, and what do? They say they begin to sing they begin to sing. They break into song, even in the text itself. We're told, so they come down, they comment on the butler and the guard being, drunk, asleep, at the table, and they say, "Oh, you've had too much already. Let's put the barrels down, right?" And then it just moves into roll, 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 rolling down the hole, heave ho, splash, plump, down they go, down they bump, and it just bursts into song. And then he says, "So it is that they burst into song, as first one barrel, and then another rumbled to the dark opening, and was pushed over into the cold water some feet below. Some of the barrels really were empty, some were tubs neatly packed with one dwarf each. But down they all went, one after another, with many a clash and a bump, thudding the top ones below, smacking into the water, jostling against the walls of the tunnel, knocking one another, bobbing away down the current." And of course, we're interjected with, at that point, Bilbo realizes a weak point. He's not in a barrel because he had to close the last barrel. So he jumps in and rides one down, like sort of this, what is the atomic bomb going down? Anyway, forget the name of the movie. But anyway, so he rides this barrel, right? He rides a barrel down in there. But they sing as it goes, and we're given the song then. He said, "So down the swift dark stream you go, back to lands you once did know. Leave the halls and caverns deep, leave the northern mountains steep, where the forest wide and dim stoops in shadow gray and grim. Float beyond the world of trees, out into the whispering breeze, past the rushes, past the reeds, past the marshes' waving weeds, through the mist that riseth white, up from mere and pool at night. Follow, follow, stars that leap up the heavens cold and steep. Turn when dawn comes over land, over rapid, over sand, south away and south away. Seek the sunlight and the day, back to pasture, back to mead, where the kine and oxen feed. Back to gardens on the hills back to gardens on the hills, where the berry swells and fills, under sunlight, under day, south away and south away. Down the swift dark stream you go, back to lands you once did know." And the beautiful part about this is that they're singing to the barrels, it seems, but they're really singing to the dwarves, whether they intended or not, but remembering that they're elves, and elves tend to have an insight into the essence of things, the inner being of things, even if that being is a dwarf inside the thing, which is the barrel. Here they are singing then. This is at a sort of a meta level of, a close reading and getting down behind the text. This rings true to the dwarves, right? They're going back to lands they once did know. This should be a comforting, despite the obvious physical discomfort of being stuffed into a barrel and jostled about into the smacking cold water. Here they're being sung a lullaby in some ways. No doubt they don't appreciate the dwarves being dwarves in the situation that they find themselves in, but we should appreciate the beauty of this gentle tenderness that pervades the superficial material discomfiture of their present situation.
Yes.
There's a gentle tenderness of somebody else lifting them up like, as though, even rolling them, like rocking a cradle, singing a lullaby, and dropping them into the waters of the primal womb of sorts that they will be born out of here as they move down the channel eventually to their destination.
I love that. I love that. There are numerous ways that you can interpret this song. And the one that comes to mind immediately, just because I was conditioned that way, is the Rankin Bass, and they completely do it wrong. They sing it.
Oh, goodness. Yeah.
Kind of work song. How do they do it? It's heave ho, splash, plump, rolling down the hole. And it's just kind of like, okay, that's not really what it would be.
Okay.
It's obvious that they're singing it while they work, but it's a different type of song than what the orcs have of the slap, crash, smack, dash, which I interpret as almost like a sea shanty, a work shanty. But this one, read as a lullaby, reads really well because they are moving out of.
It does.
They're moving out of what's called dream time back into regular.
Yeah.
Elvish time, as we pointed out later in the text in the Lord of the Rings, in Lothlorien, time is different. They have called it's a kairotic time, not chronological time. Chronos time is time that is clock time, work time, time that is regulated. And so you pace out your day hour after hour. Kairotic time is time that is party time. It's like that time where you forget that time is happening. And so they're in that world of they're in the world of the elves, which is kind of outside of time, as elves are, long-lived, they're outside of time. And so it's a bit like a dream realm. And this is, you're right, they're getting rocked to sleep, and rocked to sleep in the water, and the primordial water. But the song is a bit like a lullaby. It's like that Man in the Moon song, or like the song the Corys do of the what is it, the song of the Silky. Yeah. Speed on a board like a bird on the wing over the sea to sky. Which,
Yeah,
sea to sky, that's a different song, but it's like that. Beautiful piece of work too, because it's talking about all those things that are real, the night sky and the trees and the water, and you're going home. That's where you're going back to.
Yeah.
Not only a lullaby, it could also be sung like a dirge, like you're putting the little baby in the water to go back to its place, because it's dead, right? But it's now going back to where it's supposed to be, as a rebirth into another life, into a new. So, like all elvish things can have happiness and sorrow at the same time. Odd combination.
Yeah.
So it's a great observation that it's sung as a lullaby, and into the midst of that, you have Bilbo recognizing his mistake, as you pointed out here. He suddenly recognizes he has to be in one of those barrels, and he can't be, because he's the 13th warrior. He's the number 13, which is the odd one out of that 12 perfection thing. Sorry, there are 12 dwarves and Thorin, which makes 13, and Bilbo makes the 14th one, which...
He's the 14th, chosen for the lucky number.
He's the one that luckies the whole thing, but he's also the one, therefore, outside of that constant...
He's outside of the recipient of the luck, because he's the bearer of the luck. He's luck bearer, as we're told later. Yeah. Right.
So he has to ride on the barrels as though riding on a horse. And so this thing of him jostling with the barrel and trying to get on top of it at the end of the chapter. But yeah, it's a beautiful image at the very end that they come out of this imprisonment, this purgatorial state, and they move back into their journey again. But it's through icy water and the journey through the rocking of the primordial element, and then emerging out of the barrels too. Which, by the way, that was an interesting tidbit. Christmas time for English people is a little different from Americans. And at time they have poppers, they pop the, but they also had presents that were not like ours. They're not like these ornate. They're like small presents that would be wrapped in boxes, and you would open the box and there'd be something magical inside. And Tolkien talks about how he got at one point a little mannequin, a little doll of some kind. And I wonder if there isn't that in his imaginative world, that as a child getting this little dwarf in a box, so to speak, was like the dwarf in the barrel later on.
Yeah.
Yay, it's Christmas. And it is.
It's Christmas in Lake Town. We're opening up the door.
Lake Town, that's right. It's intriguing to note that the beginning of the chapter begins with Thranduil, which means vigorous spring, and it ends with autumnal feast, like the Feast of Shaman, Feast of Halloween for us.
Yeah.
Which, that kind of fits. Those two realms where the Fey world crosses over to our world. And then there's a little...
That's exactly it.
At the end,
And they're passing out the river of time, into the river of time again, going out the other side.
Right. Yeah. So at the very end of our chapter, then, they're hurrying through that forest river, and he says, I don't need to tell you much about that. But here's Bilbo at the end of it, and he's really wet, and he's sneezing, as he says, his explosions of suppressed sneezes he has, because he's been that
right
and cold. And he ends up getting the dwarves all the way to Lake Town. We end here with this last paragraph. There was a mighty pushing of poles. The elves that were standing in the shallow water heaved and shoved. The barrels now all lashed together, creaked and fretted. And they say, this is wrong that they're this heavy. But the raftman says there's no time for that now. And off they went at last, slowly at first, until they had passed the point of rock where other elves stood to fend them off with poles, and the quicker and quicker, as they caught the main stream, went sailing away down towards the lake. They had escaped the dungeons of the king and were through the wood, but whether alive or dead still remains to be seen.
Right, so we got Schrodinger's dwarves here.
Right. And you end with whether, you don't know whether they're alive or dead. We'll find that out next chapter. But they're out of the dream time, of chirotic time of the elves. Back in the full of men. Yeah, right. Exactly.
It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll pick up next time with they're actually getting back on their journey and being met by men and elves there in Lake Town. So
that's right.
I think that's a good place to stop.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cameron. It's been enjoyable again. So
thank you, Will.
Farewell wherever you fare to your sea journey's end.
And may the wind under your wings bear you where the sun sails and the moon walks.
Indeed. That's all I...
Down they go and down they bump, down the swift dark sea you Ro